First off, thank you for inviting me and thank you for showing up. Let me just first give you a brief introduction as to why I started studying this. In part, it was because I helped pay my way through school while waiting tables and bartending. And I was always curious why some people got better tips than me. I thought I was a perfectly good server, and yet some of my colleagues made more than me. In addition, as an econ student, tipping is kind of puzzling. People are giving away money they don't have to. And then, as was recounted, my advisor only let me keep a tipped job if I did research related to that. So all of those are how I got started in this. But I've sustained that interest in that beginning research for 40 years because tipping upends our usual expectations and understanding of the world. Usually, consumers try to obtain goods and services for the lowest price possible. Also, workers demand to know how much they're going to be paid before they agree to do a job. Employers want to control their employees' incomes because that's how they control their behavior. And the government typically requires employers to pay some set minimum wage. But with tipping, all of these things are upended. 300 million consumers in the US pay in excess of $45 billion a year voluntarily for services that they've already consumed, that's not necessary to acquire those services. 4 million tipped workers in the United States work without knowing how much they're going to be paid. Over 1 million US employers allow customers to directly pay their employees, essentially opening an opportunity for bribery and collusion between the customer and the employee against the employer. And 42 states in the United States allow employers to pay less than the regular minimum wage. Because of this unusual nature of tipping, it's just inherently puzzling. I've been studying it now for 40 years. I've published in journals of behavioral economics, hospitality management, human resources, marketing, social psychology, and sociology. I've studied everything from why are tipping customs the way they are and why do they vary across nations? Why do we tip some occupations and not others? I've studied why do people tip? What are the factors that influence their decisions about how much to tip? And what impact do tipping policies have on employees, on consumers? Over 80 publications, over 40 years. Obviously, I can't tell you everything I know in the 45 minutes they've allotted. So what I thought I would do is I'm working right now on a book, a popular press book on tipping that I've already at least got a preliminary table of contents for. One section will be on the origins of tipping customs. When, why, where did tipping begin? Why do people in other countries tip less? Why do we tip barbers and not doctors? Another section looking at the beneficiaries and victims of tipping. In essence, is tipping good or bad for servers? What about businesses? Are they better off with or without tipping? And finally, consumers. Would consumers be happier in a world without tipping? I'm going to have a section on drivers of tipping. What motivates this behavior? Why do people tip? Who are the best and worst tippers? Do tippers discriminate against women, minorities, or other classes of workers? What hacks can and do servers use to get more tips? And then I will conclude the book with the present and future of tipping. Who should you tip and how much? By the way, there is no set authority. I'm not such an authority. All I can tell you is my decision rules, but I'm not an etiquette expert. Will tipping ever go away? Who are we going to have to tip next? And will rising tip sizes hit a ceiling, or will they keep going up? I'm prepared to talk about any of these topics, obviously, because I've studied this for 40 years, I find them all interesting. And what I find interesting is not necessarily indicative of what the general public would. So I thought I would have you guys, and I can't cover it all. So I thought I'd have you guys pick what you want to hear about. And one way to do this, I guess, would be for a show of hands. Think about these topics that I've just listed. If it's in your top 3, when I call it out, raise your hand, and then we'll see where people's interest lies. And I guess I'll start with sections and then we can go into chapters. So origins of tipping customs. Is that any of these chapters in people's top 3? Okay. All right. What about beneficiaries and victims of tipping? Less. Okay. Drivers of tipping? A few. Okay. That's probably second. Present and future of tipping? Wow. Okay. So it seems like people are interested in the origins and history of tipping and the future of tipping, and less about these other things. Let me then talk a little bit about some of this. In terms of the history of tipping, first off, you should know I'm not a historian, and there are very few historical studies of tipping. I know of 2 papers in 1 book, but I've read them and I can relate to you what we know. And basically, the short answer is we don't know a lot. There are a lot of stories, but they're not necessarily correct. One account of tipping is that it began in the Middle Ages, where noblemen traveling on public roads would throw coins to the rabble on the streets as a way of ensuring safe passage. It has been attributed more reliably to the medieval custom of veils. Noblemen in medieval times started off giving serfs on their properties cast off clothing, food items, etc. Eventually started giving cash payments to these serfs for extra service. And eventually it got to the point that those servants then expected payments from visitors to the household. Because back then, when someone came, their transportation was not quick and easy. They stayed for a while. Their stay entailed extra work for the household staff. And they would line up outside of the house upon the departure of a guest with their hands out, and the guest was expected to give them a payment of money. And this payment was called vails. People argue that really that was the origin of tipping, and it went from private homes of noblemen into commercial establishments much later, but that's where the idea came from. You often hear the idea that it started in 18th century eating and drinking establishments to get better service. People talk about that patrons would wrap coins in a note with the words "to ensure promptitude" and give it to staff. I'll talk in a minute about etymology of tipping, but that's almost certainly not true. And tip isn't an acronym for "to ensure promptitude." Acronyms didn't really become popular until the 1930s, 1940s. And tipping's been in use since the word tip has been used as a gratuity, that meaning of the word tip, since 1700s. One of my favorite theories about the origin of tipping is that it began in eating and drinking establishments, not as a way to ensure better service, but as a way to diminish or reduce the server's envy of the customer. After all, when you're at an eating and drinking establishment, you're having fun, and the worker's not, they're working. It's natural for people to envy others who are better off than them. And people sometimes, take out their envy in negative ways against the subject of envy. So supposedly, tipping evolved as a way for customers to say, hey, don't envy me because I'm having fun and you're working. Here's some money, you can have a drink on me later. And this was a theory developed by an anthropologist, George Foster, at the University of Berkeley. And the primary evidence he used to support that is that the word for tip in many languages around the world translates to drink money or money for drink. In Asia, it translates to tea money, but he argued that that's pretty strong evidence that the custom evolved in eating and drinking establishments, and he thinks it's the desire to forestall envy. It was brought to the United States late in the 19th century by travelers to Europe. After the Civil War, Americans started traveling to Europe more. There they encountered the custom of tipping and brought it back. And it didn't really start taking off until the turn of the century, and in the early 20th century is when it really began. And ironically, what caused it to start to expand is that hotels at that time started turning away from what's called the American plan and adopting what's called the European plan. The American plan was that you would go and stay at a hotel and you would be charged one fee for your lodging and the food accommodations. And hoteliers didn't like the idea of tipping under that arrangement because people could slip money to the employees to get extra portions. And their fees wouldn't go up when they got those extra portions. It was one all-inclusive price. But at the time, European hotels were charging separately for food and lodging. As Americans started adopting that approach, it started to become more feasible to allow tipping, because if someone wanted extra money or extra food, they'd have to order it. They're paying on a piecemeal basis. And so there were fewer opportunities for that kind of employee theft. And Prohibition really encouraged this adoption of the European plan, because there were a major source of income was obviously liquor, but not during Prohibition. So they had to get other revenue streams. So they separated out the price of food and lodging. And that's kind of what caused tipping to take off. It faced resistance in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. It was perceived by many people as un-American, demeaning to make someone work for, alms. And it smacked of hierarchy and status that just seemed un-American. So there was a lot of opposition to it. And in fact, early in the 20th century, between 1900 and 1926, a total of 6 states actually at one point or another outlawed tipping. Obviously, those statutes didn't hold up. And ironically, today, we borrow tipping from Europe. We're the world's leader in terms of tipping. We tip more people and we tip larger amounts than anywhere else in the world. Okay. And there are recent studies suggesting that tipping is coming back in other countries to the extent that they travel to the States. The more people travel to the States, they bring tipping back home with them. So what goes around comes around. In terms of just the word tip itself, I've already told you one theory is that it's an acronym for the word to ensure promptitude, but that's almost certainly not true. It's been in use long before acronyms became common. People have attributed it to the Latin word stipum, meaning wages. That occurs via the English noun stipend. Stipend comes from the Latin stipum. And people have argued that tip comes from stipend. George Foster, whose theory of tipping as a way of forestalling envy, says that it comes from the word tipple, which means to drink, right? Other people have argued that it comes from the Low German word tippen, meaning to tap or lightly touch. And I've heard different interpretations of that. One is that you would take a coin and tap the glass to get a server's attention and then give them that coin. And that's why this tippen became tip. The other is that it also refers to a light touch on the arm or shoulder to get someone's attention, and a tip is a way of doing that. It's also been attributed to 400-year-old thieves' cant. That basically criminals in England used this language that was unique to themselves as a way of communicating without being understood by others. And they used the word tip to mean give or share. So what's the origin of the word tip? What's the real origin of the custom? Again, I'm not a historian, I don't know, but you now have a pretty good background in the various theories. I have lots of slides. I'm just trying to, in terms of national differences. Obviously, tipping is more common in some countries than others. This map shows you some of the worldwide differences. I've done not a lot, but a handful of studies where I take tipping guides, international tipping guides, to get measures of, is it common to tip various occupations, and how many occupations is it customary to tip in a country? And also for some specific occupations, most notably restaurants and taxi cabs. They're convenient because the recommendations are usually to tip a percentage, so you don't have to worry about currency differences. And then I can get other measures about the characteristics of those countries to find out what kinds of countries do they tip more service providers in, what kinds of countries do they leave larger tips in. And in general, the results are these, that tips are more common and or larger in countries whose people are more status seeking, socially outgoing. Extroversion, for example, is a strong predictor. The national extroversion score of a population is a strong predictor, both of how often people tip, how many different providers, but also how much they tip. Tenderheartedness, actually that's the reverse of psychoticism. Psychoticism negatively predicts tipping, but at a national level, what we're talking about, the range of differences, it's more within the normal range. It's not really psychotic people, right? There are too few of those. It's psychotic countries tend to be a little more tough-minded, not as tender-hearted, not as empathic and caring. The more empathic, the more people tip. Greater neuroticism, that is emotional instability. If you're prone to really be emotional, especially negative emotions like anxiety, then those countries, they don't tip larger amounts, but they do tip a greater number of service providers. Related to that, uncertainty avoidance, a value system. And the more people value avoidance of uncertainty, the greater the number of service providers they tip. But they don't tip larger amounts. Non-egalitarian, if a country, some countries are egalitarian, especially the Scandinavian countries, for example. Others are more hierarchical and accepting of status and power differences. The more accepting you are of status and power differences, the more that country will tip. And concerned with impression management. The higher the lie scores, a population. Impersonality tests, though, give you a lie scale, which is measuring your tendency to lie to make a favorable impression. And average scores on that predict national differences in tipping, such that people who care about impressions and so they lie more, they also tip larger numbers of professions and larger amounts. Okay, the question was, is the minimum wage status of a country predictive of its likelihood of tipping? Perhaps tipping is more common in countries where they have lower minimum wages. I know of only one study to look at that, and they did not find an effect, actually. The United States is, to my knowledge, the only country that allows a substandard wage to tipped employees, okay? And we have the most common tipping. I mean, we tip more service providers and we tip a larger amount. Perhaps there's a connection there, but in terms of just what is the minimum wage, you know, how livable is that, and national differences in minimum wage do not seem to predict tipping. Other questions? Sure. Yes. The comment was that in Japan, there is no tipping. And in fact, that it's almost considered offensive and people will run after you to return a tip if you give them one. And I've observed that in my own research. Japan is always an outlier, given their characteristics on personality, values, et cetera. I would have predicted much higher levels of tipping than they have. But the reason I think it has that status is in Japan, it's this thing of, it's called on, O-N. And it's a sense of obligation to repay favors that are done. And that obligation is so strong that people don't want to get enmeshed in complications of on between strangers. It's one thing to have an obligation to a family member or a close friend, but you don't want to get involved in that with someone that's not close. And once you start giving and taking, then that becomes a complication. And I believe that's why Japan is unusual in its abhorrence of tipping, given the other characteristics of its population. So the question was, how do the current efforts to present you with options and ask you to select some pre-selected tip amount, they'll usually also give you a customary tip amount. How does that impact consumers? And in particular, does increasing the amount that you ask for, how does that impact tipping? I've done a little bit of research on this. Other people have studied it. First off, people don't like being presented with these options when they have to make the decision in front of the service provider. They don't like having to make those decisions before they get the service. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to people, right? In many counter cases, some studies find that will then lower the tips. Other studies find it increases tips. I've done research, other people have done research, not looking at the presence of these options, but the size of the options and how does that affect consumers. And the short answer is the more you ask for, the more you get. Increasing the options from 5, 10 to 15 or 15, 20, 25 to 20, 25, 30. More people will not tip altogether. You'll kind of price yourself out of some people's behavior and they'll say, I'm just not going to leave anything. But others will leave a larger amount, and that more than offsets for the people who decide not to tip. So the more you ask, the more you get. I've also done research looking at what kind of downstream effects that has. It turns out that it doesn't, because you could imagine if I'm tipping more, the cost of that service is higher. And in general, as prices go up, demand goes down. But I don't find that in a laundry service that experimentally, randomly manipulated the options that people got. And once you were assigned to a condition, you always got that same condition, okay? Asking for more caused people to pay more, often substantially more, but it didn't decrease their patronage, the frequency of the patronage, the average spend when they did patronize, and it didn't affect their ratings of service quality either. So there is a reason that people are asking for larger and larger amounts, because it pays to do so. The question is, would Americans tip even more if they, in restaurants, if they knew that servers were being paid a sub-minimum wage? And the answer is yes. Many people do know that. I've done surveys where I've asked people to agree or disagree with the statement, without tip, servers would make less than the standard minimum wage. And most people, over half, agree with that statement. Now, I'm sure they don't know exactly what the tip to minimum wage is, and that varies from state to state. But they're aware, by and large, that servers are paid a sub-minimum wage. And those people who are aware of it are more likely to endorse the idea I tip in order to make up for low wages, and they leave larger tip amounts. Those people who are aware of it do in fact leave larger tip amounts. And states that have a higher minimum wage for tipped workers, there are some states like California and Washington that don't allow a tip credit at all. Those workers get the standard minimum wage for the state. But the higher the minimum wage for tipped workers, the lower the tip average in that state. So yes, awareness of substandard wages does increase tipping. And if we made it, obviously not everyone's aware of it, so if we were to expand that knowledge, presumably tips would go up. So the comment was that often when you go out to eat in large groups, they'll add an automatic gratuity. And why? And the short answer is they're afraid that you might undertip in that circumstance, especially with a very large bill. The incentive to undertip is higher, and it's to avoid that situation. The comment was that there seems to be some controversy over what you should base the tip percentage on. Is it just the cost of the meal, or is it the cost plus tax? The norm is that you base it on the cost of the meal, okay? And you don't tip on top of tax. Having said that, there are restaurants that will put tip recommendations as a convenience for the customer, and they'll say 15% given your bill equals blank, and so forth. Some of them will do it on pre-tax amount, and some will do it on post-tax amount. Servers, of course, want you to tip on the basis of meal and tax, right? But if you look at etiquette books, they would say it's the pre-tax amount. So the question is, how do you justify having to tip a maid on top of high prices, in essence? And not just maids, but other hotel employees.
But other hotel employees that they'll have, for someone that's giving you room service directly, you're getting a service from them. But having a clean hotel room, it hurts my head when I see the difference between a true service industry. And I just want to wrap my head around that.
All right. So let me start by saying only about a third of Americans say that they regularly tip hotel maids. Okay. If you go to an etiquette book, the etiquette book would say you should tip, $3 to $5 per night of stay. But most Americans don't. Believe it or not, even though I study this and I try to be a good tipper in certain circumstances, like in restaurants, because I know those servers are being paid a sub-minimum wage, I do try to tip hotel maids. I never tip baristas unless I get a frou-frou drink that they make, right? But if they're just pouring me a coffee, I don't tip counter workers, even though I study this. But what's the difference between hotel maids? It's first off, hotel maids are getting paid at least the minimum wage, but minimum wage isn't a livable wage, right? And it's hard work and not pleasant work, right? And I just feel like I don't trust, well, I know employers are going to try to pay as little as possible. That's the nature of business. And I have some compassion for those workers and don't mind leaving extra for them. So that's why I tip a hotel maid. And is that enough justification? I mean, that's every individual's personal decision. Even though I keep talking about etiquette books, the fact is etiquette books presumably are describing what is customary. There is no authority, right? There's no etiquette god who gives edicts from on high. Ultimately, tipping norms bubble from the bottom up. And that's a norm that not everybody's aware of. And again, only about a third of the country will tip a hotel maid. So, should you feel obligated to do it? No. But why might you? For the reasons I just gave. I hope that answers your question. So the comment was, really fancy hotels, I'm paying so much, they should pay their maids more. Dick, you had a comment or on that?
Yeah, got to back up. I like to pay attention to some of the detail. But I recall last hotel we were in, we could select the level of service we wanted. Right, okay. Right, so no service, better not know. No service, then light service, and then full service. And I guess the problem I have is if you have the same date every day for the light service and the full service, that would be one thing. At the end of the stay, you get $1, maybe $3 for the one, $5 for the other. But how prevalent is the pooling of tips amongst the maid staff? Maybe share them.
So I've never studied that, and no one else has either. So I don't know of any survey of hotels to find out. My anecdotal sense is that it's not that common, that the maid who picks up the tip keeps it, okay? And may not even declare it. But presumably, if the shifts are divided in such a way, in the long run, it evens out. That's going to become even more interesting because people are developing apps to help get tips in an environment where we're not carrying cash anymore. And that's not a problem in restaurants or any place where you're paying a bill, because when you pay with your credit card, you can add the tip to that. But what about the doorman or the hotel maid or the parking valet, who you don't pay them for those services? Traditionally, you would give them a cash tip, but people aren't carrying cash and they're finding that tips are going down for those professions. Well, there are a lot of enterprising people. I've talked to at least 6 different entrepreneurs who are developing apps. Some of them are already being used, like Wyndham is using one called Bene Tipping. But it's an app that you can scan. Different systems do it slightly differently, but Bene Tipping, you scan a QR code and you don't have to sign up for anything. You just have to, if you have Apple Pay, you can scan the QR code and give them a tip with Apple Pay. If you want, you can enter a credit card and give them a tip. There are a lot of these apps being developed. And hotels, I'm sorry. Oh. Oh, okay. Okay. I was saying that these apps are starting to ask people for money. And my understanding in talking to the people that developed Benet, even within Wyndham, some hotels are having the maids, because here tips can be identified, right? They're electronic tips and they're records. And some hotels are letting the staff keep them and others are pooling. But it's still new enough that I didn't ask them what's the breakdown percentage wise. But that's the answer. The question is, what should I do in a circumstance where I go to a counter, they hand me my sandwich or my coffee or whatever, and turn around and there's a screen, turn a screen around and ask me for a tip? That doesn't seem like that's a reasonable request. I understand tipping in a restaurant, sit-down environment, but not in this. And so the question is, what should I do? And I don't know how to answer that. I can tell you that I don't tip in those circumstances, personally. Okay? But I don't mind. I know for a fact that the service provider wants the tip, and they're going to think less of me for not doing it, and I don't care. Okay? If you care, then you're going to tip. Yeah, why? And you shouldn't feel guilty, but I do need to get to the research. Are there any kinds of research people want to know more about? There are so many slides. I need to know what you want to know slides about. Okay. Occupational differences in tipping. What I have here across the bottom row, you can't read these, but there are a variety of different occupations, from dentist, insurance agent, mortician, nurse, mechanic, shampooer, dog groomer, all the way up to parking valet, bartender, waiter, right? And you can see, and what we have on this vertical axis is people's rated likelihood of tipping those service providers, the average of large numbers of people's ratings. Obviously, there are huge differences in occupations and our likelihood of tipping them. And certainly one of the research questions that I became interested in is, why is that? Why do we tip waiters but not stewardesses? Why don't we tip our bartender? We do tip our bartender, but why don't we tip we tip barbers too? Our lawyer or our tax filer or our college professor, okay? And so the way I studied this was to generate 100 to 120 service occupations, have people rate those occupations on likelihood of tipping, and then rate them on a variety of other dimensions. How high status is this occupation? How much time do you spend with this person if you use their services, et cetera? And then look for relationships. What I find is that we tend to tip lower status occupations more than high status occupations, okay? In part, perhaps because the status implication of tipping. If I'm tipping you at my discretion after you've given service, I've got the power here, right? And that's okay if it's a low status person. It's not so good to be saying that to your doctor. The more customized the service, the more likely we are to tip them. Perhaps because the more customized the service, the less a standard pay is going to be adequate compensation for their efforts. If it's really customized service, they kind of deserve above and beyond a custom pay, and tipping is a way of doing that. My favorite is this third one up here, the more positive hedonic disparity between the customer and the server. That is, there are some services where the customer is happier than the service provider. Bars and restaurants are a great example. And this is the whole idea behind Foster's idea that tipping evolved as a way to forestall envy. If the customer's happier than the server, there's the potential for envy, and we might want to have tipping. But there are a lot of service occupations where that's not true. If you're seeing a lawyer, you are not necessarily happier than the lawyer. And the same is true for a dentist or a doctor, right? And then there are some service providers where it's perhaps more neutral. The hair cutter, for example, is that how much worse off are they than you? And indeed, we are more likely to tip people when we as customers are happier than the service provider. And that's some more evidence that kind of supports Foster's theory about why we tip, to forestall envy. The economist would tell you that the reason we have tipping is because customers are in a better position than managers to monitor server performance. A restaurant manager could look at a server's interaction with my table and think that they're ignoring me. But in fact, that server knows I'm having an intimate conversation and they don't want to intrude, right? I'm in a better position to tell whether I'm being ignored or whether I'm being appropriately given my privacy. It's hard for a manager to do that. And there are services where it's harder for managers to evaluate the employee performance, and it's relatively easy for customers. The greater the customer advantage in evaluating employee performance, the more likely we are to tip those employees, that occupation. And that's some support for this economic functional explanation for why we tip some and not others. What's really interesting to me, and I predicted that we would tip people that we interact with for a longer period of time, right? And that we encounter more frequently, because those are people I get to know better. And I want to help them more. And I care about what they think of me. Like I can say, I don't care if you think less of me, you counter worker, when I don't tip you, because I don't spend that much time with them. I'm not going to encounter them again, probably. But if I'm going to spend a lot of time with you, if I'm going to encounter you again, I will care and I should tip more. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Those things lead to less tipping. And all I can do is speculate, but part of my speculation is, well, first off, longer time and more frequent encounters may be higher status occupations in part, right? I see my doctor not super frequently, but more often than I see the person at the barista counter. And so we're less likely to tip high occupation things, but also if I have a relationship with someone, and unless it's a clearly defined tipping occupation like waiter, I don't want to insult them. I had this problem when I went to Australia during my last sabbatical and went on a tour of the outback, and we had a tour, and ultimately my daughter and I had a private tour and camped out in the outback with this tour guide. He was fantastic. I loved him. I wanted to tip him. I really wanted to. I was afraid because tipping's not so common there. Because I liked him, ironically, I was less likely to tip him because I didn't want to offend him and didn't want him to think that I didn't appreciate that there was no relationship, right? And so some of it may be a reluctance to turn a relationship into an economic exchange. May be part of that surprising explanation. When servers handle payment, we're more likely to tip those people as well. And I've got 5 more minutes. Can I go back to answering questions people want answered, or what? Okay. In Iceland, they pay a livable wage. They don't have tipping. The question is, if we paid a livable wage, would that eliminate tipping in the United States? It's hard to say for sure. Anybody who tries to predict the future it's a fool's errand, right? But I can tell you that there are huge differences in the income that servers make in this country. In California, servers are making a minimum of $9 an hour. They get paid the regular minimum wage, right? And there are places in Washington, Seattle, I think it's up to 12 now, and it's slated to go to 15. The federal minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.70. That's in places like Texas and Louisiana and other states. So there are huge differences in the income that servers are paid. Those manifest in small differences in average tip percentage, but only small percentage differences. Tipping is still as common in California, and they still tip in that 15 to 20% range in California, just as they do in Texas. Given that, I don't believe that tipping is going to go away if we start paying people higher wages. Maybe tip amounts will go down. I think the increase in tip amounts would probably slow down, but I think tipping will remain. The interesting thing is something to keep in mind. If you were to eliminate tipping, you'd have to raise wages, right? And you would think that a restaurant ought to be able to do that. I'll eliminate tipping, pay my people a higher wage, and I'll raise my menu prices. Yes, my menu prices are higher, but people don't have to tip. It should be a wash. It turns out that's not true. I've done the research. And when people evaluate restaurant expensiveness, they evaluate it on menu prices and tend to ignore the obligation to tip or not. So a restaurant that raises its menu prices and eliminates tipping is going to be perceived as more expensive than a restaurant where the total cost of the meal is the same, but the menu prices are lower. And that's one reason it's so difficult for restaurateurs who want to eliminate tipping. And indeed, those who do, unless they're super expensive, like Danny Myers did not see a decrease in his online ratings when he eliminated tipping in New York City. But other restaurants that have eliminated tipping, their online ratings go down, in part because customers are reacting to the higher prices. Really expensive restaurants where the clientele is less price sensitive can get away with it. But casual to lower scale restaurants can't. And that's why I don't think tipping is going to go away anytime soon. You can't get together with other restaurants in the area and say, let's all get rid of tipping. That would be price collusion and illegal. And I can't do it on my own, because if I do and you don't, I'm perceived as more expensive and I'll lose business. Is that?
One more question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Yes, in that. So the question is, if I leave a cash tip, how much of that's going to be declared, and is the provider going to pay taxes on? So this is a really complicated one for me to answer, because first off, nobody's done a survey. And if you did do a survey, people would lie. Okay. And I have some personal experience, but there's no statute of limitation on tax violations, so I'm not inclined to be completely honest either. But the IRS estimates that roughly half of all tips are undeclared. Okay, that's the IRS's estimate. And you know that all of the charge tips are being declared. So yes, I think it's safe to assume, not that none of the cash tips will be declared, but they're much less likely to be declared than a charge tip. And indeed, a lot of people will leave cash tips for that very reason, to help the server avoid taxes. And that's not an uncommon thing. I have seen some surveys where 30% of people say they will leave a cash tip even when they pay with credit card. Yeah. And I want to thank you. Your question saved this from being a boring me talking. And so it made it much more fun for me, and I'm sure for you too. So thank you for your questions.